Hi, everyone. Since the recording of our AP webinar, we've had two breaking news updates in the world of AP exams. And so we've decided to add a brief update to the end of this webinar recording to share that news and our analysis. Late last week, Yale announced a return to requiring test scores for admissions, and with it, a test flexible policy that allows students to submit AP or IB scores in lieu of an SAT or ACT score. In addition, College Board announced this week that starting next spring in May of 2025, 9 of the AP exams are switching to a fully digital format like the SAT recently did. So stay tuned until the end of this webinar to listen to the update and our advice, and I hope you enjoy the recording. Hey everyone, welcome on in. We'll give people a minute or two past the official start time to start to filter in. You know how it is with Zoom events, you get that notification on your phone and then you have to open Zoom and then the app wants to update. And so usually we start about 1 or 2 minutes after the posted start time for that reason.
Hello.
How's it going, Tori?
We don't match today
For once.
for
Yeah.
once.
I was just thinking, I'm looking at our attendee list and I see a lot of familiar faces from previous webinars, which means that people have probably heard me tell that joke about Zoom needing to update when you open it to watch a webinar like 3 or 4 times by now. So welcome to all our return viewers and to our first-time viewers who heard me tell that joke for the very first time just now. We'll give it just another minute or two for people to filter in and then we'll get started. Before we actually jump into the meat of the content today, I'm curious if anyone wants to drop into the chat what AP exams their students will be taking this spring. It might help us tailor some of the things that we say to the exams that are represented here. So the chat will allow you to post so that only Tori and I can see it, and Tori and I can post to everyone.
Human Geo, the fastest growing AP exam in the country.
Yeah.
Fun fact for you.
Yeah, typically the one that they allow younger students to take, which is the reason for the fast growth, because we're seeing an overall trend of more students taking more APs at an earlier grade level than in the past. Which most of you probably could have guessed before I said that. All right, we will go ahead and jump into it for today. Welcome in everyone to our AP exam primer, where we will teach you about all things AP. I am Jim Wismer, Director of IB Experience. So I speak with most of our new families about whatever service they're interested in here, and I directly oversee our tutoring and test prep. And I'm joined by Tori Burke, who I'll let introduce themselves.
So I am the Assistant Director of Tutoring as well as the Accommodations Specialist here on staff, and I manage all of the part-time tutors that are working with your students.
Yeah, awesome. So let's jump into it. And it helps in these presentations to start with an overview of what an AP exam is for parents who have kind of been through this with an older student or have a student who's taken AP exams before. This might be some review, but it's helpful to just kind of start at square one. AP exams are standardized tests that are given as the culmination of an AP course. And so if your student isn't in an AP course, typically they're not taking the AP exam. It is possible to take an AP exam if you're not taking the AP course, but that is the more unusual. Most of the time, it's only really going to be an option if you take the AP course. These AP courses are essentially designed to be the equivalent of an introductory college level course, which is to say that AP biology should be the same as Biology 101 at a university. And that doesn't always work out that way, but that's kind of the basic premise of the course. I think Tori's laughing because of college chemistry experience there, if I had to guess.
Yes.
So the AP exams consist of a combination of multiple choice and free response questions. More on that in a bit. But basically, there's a bubbling section and a section where you actually have to write stuff out. And then the exams are scored on a scale of 1 through 5. Now, according to the College Board, the minimum passing score would be a 3 and the perfect score would be a 5. However, for the different ways that colleges use AP exams, the colleges set the threshold. So one college may give you credit for a 3, while another college only gives you credit for a 5 or a 4 or 5. And so these policies can vary quite a bit university to university. And the fact that College Board calls a 3 passing doesn't necessarily mean that a 3 suits your specific purposes. But more on that later. And then the exams this year are administered from May 6th to 17th. Traditionally, they're the first 2 full weeks of May. And so this is just about the latest they can be in the month of May. Fun fact. And then the exams cost just under $100 in the US or $128 abroad. And then if they are the seminar or research exams, which require submission of a portfolio, then those cost a little more, almost $150. Finally, they're run by College Board, which is the parent company of the SAT and PSAT. And this is most significant in the realm of accommodations. So if your student has an extended time accommodation for the SAT, or they had an extended time accommodation for the PSAT that is already officially on file, then they will have that same accommodation for their AP exams, because College Board grants their accommodations not test by test, but sort of as an umbrella for all College Board exams. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. It also means that College Board is the place where you go to view your scores and share them with colleges.
So, there are a couple of different ways that colleges use AP exams. And the first and probably most well known is for credit for courses. So students can earn college credit for qualifying scores, and as Jim said, those qualifying scores can be between a 3 and a 5. And policies differ pretty wildly between, like, from university to university, and even between in like the colleges inside of universities, such as at Cornell, if you're taking calculus, and you might get credit for a 3 at the hotel school, while you probably wouldn't at the engineering college. Exams can also be accepted or not accepted based on major. So even in my previous example, perhaps not with Cornell, but with Bryn Mawr, where I went to school, physics was accepted if you were a chemistry major, but chemistry was not accepted if you were a chemistry major, and it was the same vice versa for the physics department. So they would accept the chemistry exam, but not the physics exam. As like a personal like anecdote, there are a lot of different ways that these exams can be used, and sometimes they're just used in like chunks. So at Bryn Mawr, where I went to college, I was a chemistry major, and if anybody knows about being a chemistry major, it's usually really hard to double major or to have a couple of minors. So a lot of people are just sort of pure chemistry. But I was really lucky because I had 14 AP exams, and actually I think I had 13. But I was able to use those exams as a block of credits and knock out a bunch of gen eds. So I was able to minor in museum studies and art history at school, where I absolutely would not have been able to do that if I needed to take my full course of gen eds. Sort of as a contrast, my little sister went to Boston University and studied economics, and she was able to use I think she had 13 AP exams as well, and she was able to use all of those, including the ones that were for economics and her calculus course, towards her major, and was able to knock her entire bachelor's degree out in 2.5 years. So she was able to also get a master's degree. All this is to say that any amount of AP exams you have are going to allow you to knock out requirements and save money. So that's true if you have 13 or however many APs, because you're a huge nerd like me, or if you have an equally delightful load of a more normal person where you have like 2 to 5 or even 1 AP exam, and you can use that credit to knock out a requirement that you don't want to do in college. So it's really dependent on the school, the major, and the individual student.
Now, a slight difference in policy is when colleges use AP exams for placement. So this is a little bit of a nuanced distinction, but essentially these colleges will let you skip a course in a sequence, but not actually give you credit for it. So this is most common in foreign languages and in English, and I'll explain kind of how and why. But essentially, let's say you took AP Spanish and a college would let you skip right into Spanish 4 as a result. Well, colleges are not going to give you credit for 3 whole classes of Spanish 1, Spanish 2, Spanish 3 on the basis of one exam score. And so what they do instead is say you don't have to take Spanish 1, 2, or 3. You can go right into Spanish 4, but you're not actually getting credit for that. And again, some colleges, not all. Other colleges might say, we're going to give you credit for Spanish 3 based on that exam score, and you can take Spanish 4. But sometimes you just get to skip and you don't actually get credits toward graduation. It's also relatively common with a general education English requirement. So a lot of colleges will have a freshman English class that every student has to take, and it's kind of focused on turning students into college level writers. And if a student scores high enough on the AP English exam, then they've proven to that college that they are the college level writers that these classes aim to turn them into. And so they let you skip it. And again, this is not going to be true everywhere, but it is just something else to look out for, a sort of nuanced little difference in how they're used, not for credit, but for placement, where you are still getting to skip to higher levels of things, but not necessarily getting those credits toward graduation and the direct monetary savings that having free credits toward graduation gets you at college where you pay for the credit. Another little distinction here is that it can impact status. So I had 28 credits when I started at the University of Pittsburgh from AP exams taken in high school. 30 credits at University of Pittsburgh was considered freshman year. So I actually entered my freshman year having sophomore status. And that meant that I was able to take more advanced classes right away. And that was appealing to me because I wanted to study linguistics. As freshmen at Pitt, you could only take this very introductory kind of survey level linguistics class, but it wasn't the real linguistics 101 yet. You weren't allowed to take that until sophomore year. Well, because of my status as a sophomore, my first year at Pitt, I was able to take that class right away. So in a lot of situations, these exams can help both in terms of placement as placing into a specific class and placement as defined by, your status within the university by year.
So probably the biggest place where AP scores have changed over the years is with admissions. So it used to be in the past that our advice was these scores don't really matter that much because they didn't matter that much. It was a little boon to your application, a little nice little buoy perhaps to explain away a not so good grade perhaps, or just in general to boost an already really awesome application. But now things have really shifted. They still are not ever required for admission, but they can be very, very valuable for students, and they are no longer just like a very small piece of the puzzle. They can be even more valuable for students that are applying without SAT or ACT scores, because it's a way to get that external validation of whatever grades that you already got. Also, this is also true for test blind schools. So test blind schools where you're not allowed to submit an SAT or ACT, such as the UC system, they still will look at your AP scores as a way to, again, validate those grades. Something that sometimes people have a concern about is that, oh, my student's a really bad test taker, I don't want to have them take it because it's automatically going to get sent or something. That's definitely not the case. You can definitely take the test without submitting the score, so there's really no harm in taking it. And the main value to these things is adding context to grades, which Jim is about to get into.
Yeah, so one thing I want to mention before going to the next slide that I skipped over in the beginning is please drop any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A, and we are going to stay as long as we have questions at the end of the presentation today. But when we talk about the increased importance of AP exams in admissions and the fact that they're used to add context to grades, it's important to keep in mind the current state of grades, which is to say inflated in a historical context. So what this grade shows is the percentage of college freshmen who graduated from high school with at least an A- average. And we can see that in 1966, when our data begins, that was around 21%. And as of 2022, the last full year for which we have this data, that was 80.6%. 80.6% of high school students are showing up at college with at least a 90% GPA. That doesn't mean 80% of high school students, because this data doesn't factor in students who don't go to college. But for the students that are in the application pool with you, the ones who are aiming to go to college, they all have excellent grades. And so that means that the grade itself is not sort of differentiating students in the same way that they have historically. And so when we compare something like grades, which have increased dramatically since the 60s, to say AP scores since 2011, which is as far back as we could find data for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to show you AP scores from two of the exams that are most common with our students, which is AP Calculus AB and US History. And you can see that these scores fluctuate from, the high teens to 25% of the students scoring a 5, scoring a perfect score on these exams. In the case of US History, we're fluctuating from, just under 10% to just over 15%, and never outside of that bound over this 13-year period. So all of that is to say that the AP score is a way to reinforce great grades, meaning that, having that A from your AP course and backing it up with a 5 is a great way to prove it to a university. And in fact, universities are actually saying this now, which is something they've never said in the past, and part of the reason for our shift in the way we're advising families around APs. I have here a quote from the Dean of Admissions at Emory University. We're not as trusting, frankly, of GPA these days. Grades are definitely inflated and not as connected to true class performance as they used to be. And then a quote from the article in which that quote appears, saying that Emory, in their new admission system, is weighing external assessment more heavily than GPA, with a particular focus on AP scores. Other things that could count as external assessment would be things like potentially letters of recommendation, but most likely more strongly the SAT and the ACT. And so colleges are in a position where, based on the fact that the vast majority of their students are applying with an A average, they need to find these other factors that are going to do a better job of differentiating the strongest students. And so that means that students, it's really in your interest to do your best on these exams.
So now that you kind of are realizing perhaps how important these are, you might be wondering, how do I find out the policy? Because I've said already that the policies really differ from school to school. Well, the first way to do this is just to Google it. Usually this colleges are not hiding these policies. They're usually right there on the admissions website, or if you do a little more digging, you can even find the more specific one for each department. If it's not immediately available, you can also contact your regional admissions officer for that school, which has the added bonus of adding to your demonstrated interest, which is a minor but legitimate part of how colleges choose who they're going to accept. And despite it being minor, as we all know, very competitive, so it's better to get that boon than not to get it. Also, if you don't know a specific department's rule, you can always also reach out to the department head, although probably you're more likely to get a response from the admissions officer. You can also search via the College Board, which is in this link that we've got on this slide, which we'll be sending out after. This link is very comprehensive, but I would say it errs on the generous end. So in my previous Cornell example, they're sort of listing it as the whole entire university rather than splitting it up between the hotel school and the engineering program. Another way to figure it out is to email us. We've got a lot of expertise on our team, and we're more than happy to help you find this information if it's hard to come by. So we are going to linger on this slide for just a little bit. Hopefully, I would recommend taking a screenshot of it. There's the next week's slide. The next week's schedule is on the next slide. On the off chance that your 16-year-old has not been totally forthcoming with their schedule, as they are wont to do.
What? 16-year-old? No.
Shocking. Um,
Kidding, students. We know you've already told your parents the exact dates and times of all your AP exams.
So the reason why the schedule is really important is you can sort of see, as is particularly relevant to me in my personal history, art history and chemistry at the exact same time. Unless you are like Hermione Granger and have a time turner, this will not be possible to attend both exams. And there is a deadline that is different for each school to let your department know. So this is usually goes through the guidance office. It's extremely important to let them know that you are taking both of those tests, that they are at the same time, so that you can then take one in the makeup period. So that's the week after the second week of AP exams. They do sort of, when they can, try to not line up tests that are likely to be taken by the same person. If we go to the next slide, I think we'll see here, for example, that Calculus AB and Calculus BC are happening at the same time. No one's allowed to take both of those classes at the same time, so they've stacked those. But nobody really knows if you're extremely interested in both biology and Japanese language. And again, these deadlines are usually pretty firm, so it's really, really important to let them know because they are going to be saving space. Sometimes they can make an exception, but it's always better to be really on top of these things.
Now, if your student's taking any of the AP courses that require digital portfolios, they have a separate set of deadlines. So I'm not going to talk much about these because there's relatively few of our students who are taking them, but I'll just linger on the slide for a bit so that we can get any relevant deadlines down that we need to. These digital portfolios are submitted separately from the rest of the exam and sometimes involve a presentation element as well. Now, let's talk about how to actually get ready for these exams. And essentially, you can think of preparing for an AP exam as falling into two buckets. You have the content of the exam and the format of the exam, and you need to be well prepared for both. So content often takes longer to prepare for. And in fact, it's the whole point of a year-long AP course to learn all of that content. So if you are behind on content, usually that's the kind of thing you want to jump on right away. So we recommend sort of doing an assessment of your content knowledge first. So when it comes to evaluating your comfort with the content, some of it's going to be obvious. If you just say, look, back in Unit 3, I really had no idea what the teacher was talking about, then you know, okay, let me start there and really try to figure that out. You can use your grades as a guide, but not the only guide. And what I mean by that is using your grades relatively. So you're going to know that, you got your worst unit exam grade on a certain unit, you got your best unit exam grade on a certain unit. And so you can sort of budget out your prep time for each content area based on how well you actually did in that unit. Another thing to consider here is how long ago it was, because you might need more refreshers on things you learned in October than things you learned in April. Surprise, I know. The practice tests that you can find in various prep books are great, and free response questions can be helpful as well. To actually look at and do exam questions and see, okay, what am I consistently missing questions on? Or in the case of a free response question that you might not be able to grade yourself, how confident am I that I could really execute this right now? And that will give you a good sense of the actual content that you need to review. Your method of content review is hard to generalize about because that's going to look a lot different for AP US History and Calculus BC. So, we'll leave that to a sort of separate one-on-one conversation. But then the second point is to learn the format of the exam. So for some students, and especially younger students who haven't done much standardized testing yet, learning the art of the multiple choice question can be really important if we have freshmen in here who are taking their first AP exam. And if you haven't been exposed to the multiple choice question very often, I would say for most of our, juniors who have been through SAT or ACT prep, especially as we do it, those students are going to be well versed in the sort of how-tos of and best practices for multiple choice questions. So you wouldn't necessarily need to prepare as much for that piece of the exam. It's not that complicated, a multiple choice question. But the free response questions of each exam type are quite nuanced. And the free response questions in something like, calculus, where, okay, you have to do a math problem, you have to show your work step by step. You're going to get partial or whole credit, just like you have on math tests your whole life for showing every step of your work. That all makes sense, right? But it's when you get to, for example, AP US history, and you have to write a document-based question response, DBQ. And sorry to any shudders up the spines of AP US students that I just sent. But when you have to write DBQs, there's a very rigid format in which you have to compose your answer to get the most points. And so as a student, it's your responsibility not just to write a good essay when it's time to answer that, but to very specifically hit on everything that the rubric dictates that the graders evaluate you on when they read your answer. And the same would go for something like AP English. You might think it's more subjective. It's not very subjective at all. These graders are given a very tight rubric and not a lot of time to grade each essay. And so they are checking for each thing in that rubric, giving you a score and moving it along. And you will find that those graders differ very seldom on the scores that they're giving. So it is more standardized than you'd think, even when it looks more subjective in a softer subject like an English or a history. But either way, I really recommend getting professional feedback on free response questions. Often teachers are going to make themselves available to do this. The best AP teachers, they build the free response questions into the curriculum. They assign them as homework or include them as part of their actual exams. And that is really helpful for students because then they're getting actual graded practice on the format of question that they're going to be asked to reproduce on the real test. If your teacher hasn't been forthcoming with assigning a lot of those free response questions for you to get the hang of it, then you can even ask them individually first to say, hey, Mr. So-and-so, I have this prep book. If I were to write one of the free response questions, would you be able to look it over and give me any feedback? And if they say yes, great. Teachers are very busy people, and sometimes they might not have the time to do that for every student with their other responsibilities. And so our tutors will do the same thing for our students, where we'll assign free response questions, give students targeted feedback according to the actual rubric of the exam, and make sure that they're prepared to do their very best on the actual exam.
So, as Jim just alluded to, we work with lots and lots of AP students every year, and how we work with them really differs. So the very first step, though, with everyone is to match the student with a subject matter expert that's perfect for them, or at least we hope they're perfect for them. I'm the one that actually does the matching, and so I can say confidently that if you provide us the most information possible about exactly what your students' goals are, what kind of student they are, what kind of person you think they're going to work best with, we'll do our very, very best to match them with one of our awesome tutors, of which we have many, many. We will then, with the tutor, create a plan based on the student's needs. So if you've ever worked with us for an SAT or an ACT, you might know that although we do personalize the actual prep for each student, the way it looks is usually pretty similar, with some wiggle room. In that the frequency and the length of the sessions is typically once a week for about an hour. And we usually recommend about 10 to 12 weeks. In this case, it really varies widely. I've had students work with me 5 days a week for 30 minutes. I have students that work with me for AP Chem once a week for an hour, just like with my SAT students. And I also have students that work with me once every 2 weeks for only a half hour. It really depends. Are they coming in at the 4-5 level and they want a 5, or are they coming in at a 1 level and they really want a 5? It also really depends on how motivated your student is. So students that are really raring to go, we're not going to really be assigning quite as much homework. A lot of times that's a lot of them doing a lot of studying and bringing us their questions. Whereas students that, surprising everyone, are not super thrilled to be studying for their AP Chemistry exam, I can provide a much, much more in-depth study plan, as can all the rest of our tutors. And that goes for every other exam as well. So definitely give us a call, and we're more than happy to set up a plan that works perfectly for your student. The final thing that we do is provide feedback for the parents after every session. So you should be getting a nice recap of the session every time.
Awesome. All right, thanks everybody for hanging around for our AP webinar. At this point, we'll open it up to questions. We had a couple come in, so we'll jump straight into those. But in the meantime, drop any questions you have in the chat and the Q&A. Our first question, which is, it feels like a tradition in our AP webinar because it's the first question we answer every year, which is, how does it look to admissions if you took an AP test, but you don't submit the score? And I will answer this from a couple different standpoints. First of all, let me say that if you take the AP test but don't submit the score, it looks the same to a university as if you did not take the AP test from an admissions standpoint. From an admissions standpoint, at every college whose policy I'm aware of, you self-report your AP scores, meaning you're going to write them into the application. I took this exam, I got this score, this exam, I got that score. Now, later down the line, when it's time to actually attend that university, you're going to have to send your official score report. So you will get caught in a lie. You can't just say you got whatever you want to say you got. But the point is that from the university's perspective in that self-reporting admissions phase, they either see a score there or they don't. And they have no way of telling, did this student take the exam and not get a good score, or did the student not take the exam? They're going to view those the same, and probably, if I had to guess, err on the side of assuming the student didn't do well or didn't take the exam because they didn't think they'd do well, because if the student thought they would do well, then why wouldn't the score be there? But the point is that there is no reason not to take the exam unless the registration fee would be a hardship on your family, and College Board has fee waivers in place for that anyway. So another question, where can students find practice tests and questions for an AP exam? Tori, I'll turn that one over to you.
Yeah, so luckily, because these tests have been around for a long time, there's a lot of material available for free online in terms of like actual FRQs right from the College Board. So for the chemistry exam, for example, I'm pretty sure that there are more than 100 FRQs available right on the College Board's website. If that's not what like kind of up to speed, we are more than happy to recommend our test prep book of choice for that particular test. Those are not always from the same company. Like there's different companies like really specialize in different exams. So you can sort of ask us specifically what you're looking for, and we're more than happy to make a recommendation.
Yeah. For multiple choice questions, you really have to go third party because College Board doesn't make the past multiple choice questions available to students. Teachers will have access to a bank, and so you can potentially approach your teacher about getting additional multiple choice questions. They may have access to more materials that they can share with you. They may not, because they may use those as test questions in their classes, which is why those aren't made publicly available a lot of the time.
Mhm.
Another question, how does it look to admissions if you take the AP class but don't get an A in the class? Meaning, is it better to try the challenge and not excel, or better to take an honors class and get a better grade? It's a good question. And our philosophy on this kind of boils down to, if you're taking an AP class and you can't quite get the A and it's your hardest class, it takes more time than your other classes, that's okay. You should still be doing everything you can to try to make it an A. But at the end of the day, if your goals are highly selective colleges, you need to have the academic rigor and the grades, and the lack of one is going to be as impactful as the lack in the other. So taking the chance on yourself and trying it is okay. What's not okay when it comes to AP course selection is if taking that course and trying to keep your head above water with a B is going to take so much of your time and so much of your energy that it's taking away from your ability to do well in your other classes, that it's taking away the time that you would want to be spending on the extracurricular activities that are most fulfilling to you and that are also important for college admissions, that you're losing sleep and it's impacting your mental health. That's the point at which it makes sense to take your foot off the gas. So it is okay to challenge yourself with an AP course, and it's not the end of the world if it doesn't go as well as you'd like it to. But, you do have to be realistic when too much is too much. And I realize that's a very kind of generic answer. The truth is, these decisions always come down to the individual student and their situation. So it's hard to comment on this too broadly. We do have a personal advising service where we do one-on-one meetings, or rather, as in us with your family, the student and at least one parent, where we talk through course selection for your student in detail based on their history of grades, their extracurricular activities, what their schedule is going to look like. So if you have some kind of deeper individual questions about this, I'd advise you to reach out, QR code right here. And you can ask us about getting set up with an advising meeting, because I think that would make a lot of sense.
And one other point that I'd like to make is that it really also depends on why they didn't score as well. So if they I've had a couple of students that have gotten a B+ in calculus and then gotten a 5 on the test. And that's really where that external validation really comes into play, probably at the highest and most important level. So if that teacher is just kind of a really hard teacher, but they're really, really well preparing you for that test, getting that 5 on that AP calculus exam is, if anything, more important than getting that A in the AP calculus class. Not that either one is less, well, the class grade is still quite important because of your GPA, but there are ways to mitigate that if you happen to have a student that is really good at test taking. So it's another thing that we can definitely work on with you.
Yeah, great point, Tori. Another question, is there a number of APs that mid to upper tier schools, not high tier, are looking for? Good question. There are a couple layers to this question. So one is, I'm not exactly clear on the terminology you were using, but I will say the most selective schools in the country, you need to take the most challenging curriculum that your school offers, and you need to get flawless grades in it. That's the reality of applying to the most selective schools in the country. There are fewer spots at those schools than there are valedictorians in America. So the truth is that everything needs to be perfect to maximize your chances there. When we step away from those very most highly selective schools in the entire country, then the picture gets a lot murkier. And what I'll say is two things. One is that you're held to the standard that your school allows. With your high school transcript will go something called a school profile. And that school profile is it includes a lot of information about your high school to provide context to an admissions office. So for instance, if you're applying to, say, Penn State University from a Philadelphia suburban public school, they don't really need the school profile because they read a ton of applications from your specific high school every year. They get it. But if you're applying from that same high school to a small liberal arts school in California, they don't know a single thing about your high school. And so they really need that school profile to understand, where is this student coming from? And so different schools offer different numbers of AP courses. And so we can't really give a number of AP courses that you should want to take. There are schools that don't offer AP courses. They use their own curriculum and they don't do anything with College Board's AP curriculum. But in that case, you're not held accountable to have AP scores, because the colleges understand that the most challenging courses you can take are not AP courses. They might even be more challenging than AP courses, but they're just not AP courses. So I can't really give a straight answer to this question, but I will say that colleges do care about both the rigor of a student's coursework and the grades that they achieve. So you do have to find balance between the two. All right, it looks like the well has run dry of questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging around. If you have any more specific questions or are looking to set up tutoring, please do contact us. We're happy to talk anytime. If your questions are specific to AP Science exams, especially, I will point you in the direction of Tori. And any of your general questions, really, either of us will be able to answer. So thank you so much and have a great night. Bye-bye. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar update. So last week, Yale announced its decision to return to requiring test scores for admissions. So with that, They're allowing students to substitute AP or IB exam scores for their SAT or ACT score. Now, Yale does not actually say how many scores a student would need to substitute for the SAT or ACT. So essentially, it seems to be a policy of submit whatever AP scores you have instead of that SAT or ACT. So a few slides ago, we had said that AP scores are not required for admissions, but they can be required in the case of applying to Yale. If you don't choose to send an SAT or ACT score and you don't have IB scores, in that case, you would be required to send your AP scores to Yale. So this policy is known as test flexible, when you can submit AP or IB or other testing scores instead of an SAT or ACT score. And that test flexible policy existed even before the pandemic. Test flexible exists at some test optional schools now. For example, NYU allows you to send at least 3 AP scores instead of your SAT or ACT score for consideration for admission there, but they are a test optional school. So Yale is the first college to sort of, since the pandemic, dictate this policy of being test flexible, but actually requiring a student to submit test scores. And so we had mentioned earlier that AP scores can be more highly scrutinized when a student applies to college without an SAT or ACT test score. And you can think of this Yale policy as sort of a more extreme version of that, meaning they are not only saying that your AP scores will be more highly scrutinized, but your AP scores will be put on the same level as what your SAT or ACT score was previously. Now, in terms of the mechanics of this policy, you self-report your scores first, and then you will send Yale an official report after you're accepted. And Yale has said on the terms of their policy that if a student's scores don't match up, their self-reported scores and their official scores don't match up, then Yale may rescind that student's admission. And so the other important note on that front is that Yale is asking students to share all of their AP scores. So a few slides ago, when we had said that if you weren't happy with an AP score, you just wouldn't have to self-report it. If you're applying to Yale under this test flexible policy, not sending an SAT or ACT score, then you would in fact need to send all of your AP scores, and you would need to self-report all of them, because if you don't self-report, but then it shows up on your official report later, that's a discrepancy, and Yale has specifically said that that's not allowed. It remains to be seen if any other colleges will follow suit on this policy, and we will, of course, keep you updated if they do. The other important piece of news is that 9 of the AP exams are going to an exclusively digital format starting next spring in May of 2025. So those exams are AP African American Studies, which will be a new AP course that year, AP Computer Science Principles, both AP English exams, AP European History, AP Psychology, AP Seminar, AP US History, and AP World History Modern. So these digital AP exams, they haven't announced what the specific format changes will be in these new exams, just that they will be in this new digital format. So we've seen digital AP exams before, especially during the height of the pandemic in 2020. All of the AP exams were exclusively digital. And College Board has had a lot more practice with digital testing with the prior year rollout of the International Digital ACT or SAT, excuse me, and this year's rollout of the digital SAT domestically. So we don't anticipate this to be a massive change for students. It's just something to keep in mind that, parents, if you had an older student take AP US History and take their exam on paper, that won't be an option for a student who's testing in 2025 or later. So again, this is a decision that you should be aware of, but it's not something to necessarily change your strategy around or anything like that. So thanks for tuning into the addendum here, and hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.